All right, so welcome to another episode of Mr. K is Wrong. And if you're wondering what that title means, it refers to somebody I knew back in my high school days who was he was a Republican leaning guy, conservative and all that, but he seemed relatively sane, down to earth, and I actually got along with him reasonably well, but over the years I've noticed that he's gone down this far right rabbit hole like so many other people. And basically, this podcast is to debunk his meme posts and comments on Facebook. And it's gotten so bad that I actually did one episode where I had two guests who were former neo Nazis who assessed if one of his memes that he posted was anti Semitic and Nazi-esque, and sure enough they agreed that it was. So that's to give you some indication of just how far you know down the rabbit hole he has gone. And this time it's going to be a little bit less extreme in some respects, but still pretty far out there, because we're going to be talking about a meme that he posted that sort of paints all liberals and leftists with one brush. And I'm going to try to be you know, tactful about this, because I understand why people do that. And that can, of course, happen also with people on the left who want to depict all right wingers the same and all that sort of thing. So, there's a certain danger of, you know, painting them all with one brush. Of course, I do have a clickbaity title here because I'm going to be referring to right wing dullards. But I do have to assure you that there are definitely some left wing dullards out there too. And it's a bit of a clickbaity title, but what can you do? But anyway, assisting me in my efforts, I turned to ChatGPT yet again, although technically this was the Right For Me AI that I used. And I asked it, please debunk this right wing meme, and I want to distinguish between these political categories, including between authoritarian state communism and anarchist communism. The meme has a picture of a hammer and sickle, and the text reads, "It doesn't matter what they call themselves. They started out as Marxists, then communists, then socialists, then liberals, then progressives, then social democrats. Same game, different names. They change the name as people catch on." So that was that was the meme that Mr. K had shared. And how did ChatGPT respond? It said, to critically analyze and debunk the meme, it's important to explore the distinct political categories mentioned and assess whether the claim that they represent the same game holds any merit. The meme implies that these political ideologies and movements are interchangeable and share a uniform agenda that becomes clearer over time. However, this oversimplification overlooks significant historical, ideological, and practical differences between these terms. Here's a breakdown to clarify these distinctions. And it does a pretty good job of actually doing so. You know, uh, I use ChatGPT because if you have it so that AI can debunk these claims, obviously the meme is weak. It's not something that withstands scrutiny. And these claims, sure enough, are definitely oversimplification. So the first thing ChatGPT looked at was Marxism. It noted that the core idea is that it's based on the works of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Marxism focuses on the idea of class struggle, the abolition of private property in favor of collective ownership, and the eventual establishment of a stateless, classless society. So Marx refers to it as the withering away of the state that is supposed to happen eventually. And that's actually one of the criticisms that people make of Marxism, is that sure, you can have a dictatorship of the proletariat as they recommend or as they suggest will be inevitable, But there's certainly no guarantee that a dictatorship is going to easily or voluntarily go away. So that's really one of the weaknesses of the Marxist, I guess, not necessarily philosophy, but prediction of how things would unfold. And of course, there's also state and authority. Marx did not provide a detailed blueprint for post revolutionary governance, but he envisioned a dictatorship of the proletariat as a transitional phase leading to communism. And, this isn't ChatGPT talking right now. This is me noting this following point. That's one of the important important things to remember is that Karl Marx actually was not alive during Stalin's reign, so he was not there to sort of guide communism. It was a thing that was established by the unique historical circumstances and the unique situation that was happening at that time and place. So to even badmouth Karl Marx for everything that happened, it's actually a little bit erroneous to do that, because there's certainly things that Stalin and these other dictators did that probably would not have sat well with Karl Marx, or of course other contemporaries of his. But anyway, ChatGPT notes that the goal was that true Marxism aims for a classless, I almost said clueless, maybe a Freudian slip, but anyway, classless and stateless society, which differs significantly from how it has been implemented historically. And that's another key point, which I'm very glad that ChatGPT actually brought up, because it's simply a fact that the state communism never really was implemented historically in a way that truly made a classless and stateless society. As I noted, and as of course many anarchists have noted and anarcho-communists noted, the uh, the historical reality of authority and power is that it wants to preserve itself, and that certainly was a phenomenon in all of these communist states. So, of course, communism is related to Marxism in a general sense, but oddly enough, not it's not necessarily hinged on it, because you can have some communistic conceptions that really don't necessarily have much to do with Marxism or anything that Karl Marx said. Like if you favor the idea of a cashless, moneyless society or something like that, that's it's sort of in the ballpark of Marxism, but you can technically have that idea without even knowing that Karl Marx existed, right? You could technically have those sorts of ideas in your head. But anyway, ChatGPT continues talking about communism. Authoritarian state communism refers to regimes such as those in the Soviet Union under Stalin, Mao's China, and North Korea. These states were characterized by a one party system, centralized control, and a high degree of authoritarianism. The original Marxist vision was adapted to fit national goals, often resulting in dictatorial control rather than the classless, stateless society Marx proposed. And again, that's a very important thing to notice, that Marx proposed some things that were inevitably not going to happen, especially not in any universal sense. He was not, well, he obviously was not, a magician. He wasn't a god or something like that. He merely predicted that things might happen a certain way, and maybe he made strong predictions and bold claims. But of course, to uh, to assign all the blame for what happened to him is actually a little bit misleading. And I don't want to sound like I'm necessarily that big of a staunch Karl Marx defender here, but it's nevertheless true. That's what I'm saying. It's just how things were and are. So next, I wanted ChatGPT to comment on anarchist communism. Pardon me for coughing. But anyway, it notes that this variant seeks a stateless, non hierarchical society where all property is communal and decisions are made collectively. It fundamentally opposes the authoritarian nature of state communism, advocating for voluntary cooperation without a centralized state. So, a lot of people forget that anarchist communism exists, or libertarian communism as it has sometimes been called, but of course, there are important historical figures in the anarcho communism movement, like Kropotkin. And, he's got an interesting life story. I could go into detail on that maybe a little bit, but I'll save that for another episode. Long story short, they reject the centralized state while still having a communist vision, if you want to call it that. And also, socialism is potentially distinct from some of those things too. So the definition for that is that it encompasses a broad range of political and economic systems that prioritize social ownership of the means of production and distribution. This can include both state managed economies and more decentralized cooperative models. And of course, in certain offshoots, you might even have sort of a mixed economy that would allow for markets of some kind. In fact, that's kind of what society probably does have in a lot of different countries. I think most systems are mixed in some way. So the divergence here is that while some socialist movements align with Marxist ideals, democratic socialism and other variants advocate for gradual reform within democratic frameworks rather than violent revolution. The Scandinavian model of social democracy, for example, integrates significant social welfare with market economies, much like I said. So, ChatGPT is correct about that. Most of these actual societies are mixed, these economies are mixed. And, the marketplace in general, it's never truly 100% capitalistic because, as I've noted about a billion times, the economy is actually a legal framework and a global legal framework in many ways now, as the years go on. And what does that mean? It's not entirely free. It's dominated by laws and international agreements and government, in other words. Another way to say law is government or governance. So this idea that there's some invisible hand guiding everything along, and that people are just freely making all these choices innocently and voluntarily, it's basically hogwash. At the core of it, there's somebody kind of aiming a gun at people's heads, and if you don't have money and property or a place to stay or something, eventually a cop is going to come along and tell you to move it along. And that's how the system actually functions. It's not just people freely making decisions in a happy scenario. It's a power structure, and there are power struggles within that structure. You know, so that's kind of what prompts different movements to spring up in the first place. So ChatGPT then looks at liberalism. It says the foundation is that it is originating in the Enlightenment. Liberalism focuses on individual rights, personal freedoms, and democracy. Classical liberalism supports free markets and limited government intervention. So, what does government intervention mean? It can obviously mean a lot of different things. In reality, the government is intervening in the economy all the time. As I mentioned, there are different legal frameworks that are always happening. Private property is being protected by the police, and there are copyright laws. all sorts of restrictions on trade. Like Donald Trump, for example, wants to impose tariffs. Well, that is government intervention right there. It's actually going to be a tax, and it's not just a tax on other countries. It will, in a very real way, be a tax that is paid by the average consumer of goods in the United States. It's going to be a tax that will be widely felt throughout the not just national economy but internationally. Although, of course, some people say, "Oh, that's not government invention because it's a Republican doing it." So, you know, that's the way logic works for some people, I guess. But ChatGPT continues. It talks about modern liberalism. In contemporary political discourse, it often refers to center left positions that advocate for social justice, regulation to correct market failures, and welfare state policies. Basically, welfare state policies are policies that suggest that people should at least get the crumbs off the table. You know, that the so called trickle down economy actually should trickle down a little bit. And one of the ways you do that is you actually try to make sure that people get something. And of course, one of the exaggerated concerns over time is how do you pay for it, and how do you prevent abuse and all that kind of stuff, with the obvious point that they're missing being that, well, if these people had more of a say over the economy in the first place, they wouldn't need these welfare state policies. We might not even need the welfare state to begin with. We might not even need government exactly as we know it if, people had more power, if the economy was more decentralized and actually managed by workers and consumers. It would sort of render the welfare state irrelevant, at least potentially. But that's sort of a point of view that's not allowed to be discussed in the conceptual framework that is so often rammed down people's throats. But ChatGPT continues uh, on the difference from socialism and liberalism, or between those. It says, unlike socialism, liberalism does not seek collective ownership of production, but supports regulated capitalism with social safety nets. Of course, the safety nets part is implying that without those things, society would be less safe. And what do you know? That's a point where I actually agree with liberalism. And I think it's fair to say that it's a form of revolution insurance. If you get rid of those safety nets, if you yank away certain benefits, it creates a more tumultuous society. And what about progressivism? So progressivism, as ChatGPT notes, is a political movement that seeks reform to address social inequalities, promote environmental sustainability, and ensure broader access to civil rights. So, what do you know? A lot of these Republicans want to do away with civil rights in a lot of ways. But anyway, progressivism emerged in the early 20th century as a response to the excesses of industrial capitalism. And of course, the Republican mindset is to say there were no real excesses of industrial capitalism. It's almost like they need it to be a flawless system. You can't perceive any needs to improve it, especially through any sort of government action. You can't rein in polluters. You can't have, I guess, regulations of products to make them less safe, etc., etc. So, even though in the news we see all these stories about, contaminated foods or whatever, just leave it up to the magic of the marketplace. That's the flawless industrial capitalist system that they cling to as an ideology. And then ChatGPT looks at policy versus ideology. It says progressives are pragmatic, often advocating policies that blend market and state solutions without aiming to abolish capitalism altogether. And that's one of the key features of standard progressivism. It tends not to seek to end capitalism, but definitely seeks to moderate its more negative aspects, which some people deny even exist, of course, as I just said. So ChatGPT goes on to discuss social democracy. The nature of social democracy is a capital, or no, a political ideology that supports economic and social interventions to promote social justice within the framework of a capitalist economy. It seeks to balance a market based economy with extensive welfare programs and regulations. And like I said, that the Republicans often want to do away with regulations unless those regulations benefit the rich. You know, if that's the case, then they want all sorts of regulations. So ChatGPT makes a key distinction. Unlike communism or socialism, social democracy accepts the premise of private ownership and capitalism, but seeks to mitigate its negative effects through policy measures. And on refuting the meme's claim, ChatGPT notes that there's a misleading conflation. The meme implies that these terms are synonymous or represent a single evolving agenda. However, the reality is that these political ideologies have significant differences in their goals, methods, and historical applications. Well, even in recent history, you can see this because there is, of course, a big difference between what certain progressives and leftists would want and what the Democratic Party does. There's infighting there quite often, and that's despite the mainstream media not really paying that much attention to it. But if you're actually involved in, you know, these types of politics, come up, you come across these issues all the time. For example, like the United States doesn't have universal health care, and the Democrats don't want universal health care. A lot of progressives are largely anti war and all that sort of thing. Well, the Democrats are largely pro war, for example. So, you don't necessarily need to look that far back in history to see these differences. Of course, the Democratic Party supports the genocide in Gaza, and a lot of progressives don't support that. In fact, I hesitate to say you would be a progressive if you were in support of that. But anyway, ChatGPT notes the historical context. Many movements emerged in response to different economic, social, and political conditions. For instance, progressivism evolved from social concerns during the Industrial Revolution, while social democracy developed as a response to the failures and successes of capitalism. So, I just did the almost Freudian slip of saying emerged, but the fact is that you do have some cross pollination between a lot of different ideologies, so it's not quite as big of a Freudian slip as someone out there might think. Um, just think about it like this: liberalism and conservatism in general are relative terms, so you can be relatively conservative on one issue, relatively, liberal or progressive on another. That's kind of the way this stuff works. They're comparative. So, as far as practical applications, ChatGPT notes that while some political ideologies may share common roots or goals, such as addressing inequality or ensuring workers' rights, their approaches to achieving these goals differ greatly. State communism's authoritarian methods are fundamentally at odds with the democratic and decentralized goals of anarchist communism, social democracy, and liberal progressivism. So that is an absolute fact. It's just fundamentally true that those different groups are at odds with each other to some extent. So, in conclusion, ChatGPT notes that the idea that all these political labels represent the same game ignores the profound differences in ideology, strategy, and outcomes. And sure enough, outcomes can be important when it comes to your ability to predict them. One of the reasons that I reject authoritarian communism, for example, is similar to what I just said earlier. If you have a system of authority and it's near absolute authority, like a state communist regime, what makes anybody think that it's going to voluntarily wither away? That to me seems like a naive concept, and I hesitate to say that one needs to be an anarchist or even any other political label to understand that. It's just sort of a common sense critique that power is not going to go away so easily unless there's some truly unique circumstances that encourage that to happen. And while it is true that political movements sometimes shift or rebrand as they evolve and as historical contexts change, equating all left leaning ideologies as variations of communism is an oversimplification that misrepresents both history and political theory, ChatGPT says. Each of these movements must be understood in its own right, acknowledging their distinct principles and impacts on societies where they have been influential. And they have been influential for sure, but so has the clinging of the masses to the status quo. And I guess we'll see how much longer that can be sustained because, frankly, it seems like it's leading down a very darkened path. And one of the aspects of that is just dumb memes that circulate online like this one.